All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this valuable Power Retail session brought to you today by payment platform provider Assembly Payments. Thank you all for joining us. I'm Pranitha Govender. I'm the editor of Power Retail, and I'll be introducing our guest speaker very shortly. Before the introduction, some quick housekeeping. Mobile phones, if you can please turn these to silent. You probably want to pay attention this morning because it's going to be a great session. At the end of the presentation, we'll have time for questions. You can enter these at any time in the question dialog box on your dashboard, and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can. We've got a big session ahead this morning, so get comfortable. Today we have Ben Jackson, Head of Operations at Assembly Payments, who will uncover 5 best metrics to measure and help you identify, improve, and mitigate online fraud in the future. Today, Ben will provide you with actionable insights to eliminate your exposure to fraud entirely, removing the risk and burden from continually evolving threats. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ben Jackson.
Thank you very much for that, Pranitha. Welcome today, everyone. Happy to go through this with you. And first things first, we're just going to start out by moving through how fraud is in the industry today. So this encompasses Australia, but also in some aspects, other geographies such as the United States and Canada for a more global perspective. So in terms of fraud, it is actually on the rise, and as per APCA 2017 in Australia alone, for the most part, it has actually been increasing every single year, and it is actually up 16% on last year, which is a pretty significant increase when you think about it, as the e-commerce economy continues to grow. 78% of all of that card fraud is actually card not present transactions. So for those of you unfamiliar with that term, it is essentially just an online credit card transaction that is a fraudulent reason code when it comes to a chargeback. And for every single dollar that you receive in fraud, you're actually having a cost of $2.40 to your business for every single $1. Now, that happens because of you're losing the actual money that you have for the goods or service or the product or anything like that you've actually provided to a customer, as well as the value of that good product or service. Then there is chargeback fees involved, and also the time that you're actually taking to manage that kind of stuff. So it does actually rack up the costs over time. And out of all of those card not fraud present transactions, 52% of those are for goods and services. So they are those tangible items that you are actually going to have a loss on. So that's actually pretty significant in terms of just running your business and your bottom line when it comes to actually trying to prevent fraud and mitigate against it. So I'm going to launch into the first metric now. And the first one that we're going to look at is chargebacks, or more specifically, the chargeback rates. So in all honesty, this is actually something that is pretty basic, and every business should be managing or at least recording already. So just to be 100% and make sure we're all on the same page, a chargeback is essentially when a consumer disputes a transaction. Now, this happens through their issuing bank, but it's done through the card schemes. So globally, we're talking Visa, MasterCard, Amex, Discover, and I mean, even if you're talking about China, then we're talking about UnionPay as well. So these fraudulent transactions, these chargebacks, I should say, they can actually come in many different reason codes. There's actually around about 150 different reason codes across the card schemes, and not all of them are actually fraud. It can relate anything from goods and services not received, or goods and services not as described, or it can actually just be a card not present fraud transaction. So when we're looking at calculating our chargeback rate, the basic formula is the number of chargebacks per month divided by the total number of transactions per month, and that will equal your chargeback rate. Now, just to be clear, this does get a little bit tricky because the calculation that you can see there is actually the Visa method. So that's how Visa looks at chargebacks on a monthly basis. MasterCard is a little bit different, and they calculate by the current month's chargebacks divided by the previous month's transactions. So it is actually important that you make a differentiation between those two card schemes. When we talk about an ideal chargeback rate, as unbelievable as it sounds, there is such a thing as a healthy chargeback rate. So if you're under 0.2% of all of your total transactions, that's actually generally too low. Now, the reason for that is because it's possible that you're actually throttling your sales conversion because either you or your gateway or your payment provider are declining too many transactions or rejecting too many transactions after a manual review. So you do expect to see a certain amount of chargebacks on an ongoing basis, even if it's just consumer confusion. Now, from the too high perspective, if you're at anything over 0.75%, then you're getting into some dangerous territory. And anything above that, and you're looking at getting put onto an early warning network if we're talking about Visa, or if you start to get up to 1%, you're actually looking at being put onto an excessive chargeback program or a chargeback monitoring program by MasterCard, and your actual acquirer might actually shut you down because you have crossed that 1% threshold. So what you're looking to aim for here, if you're a lower risk merchant, so lower risk would just be your general kind of products, I guess. So we're talking about books, or it might be, knickknacks, t-shirts, that kind of stuff. When we're talking about high risk merchants, we're talking about your traditional high risk ones, which are your airlines, your jewelry, digital goods or services, games are another big one. So because of the profit incentive for a fraudster for the high risk merchants is higher, you're going to see a higher chargeback rate that is acceptable than you would for a low risk merchant. So you want to be between 0.2 and 0.4 for low risk, 0.4 and 0.6 for high risk, because that allows for your normal run-of-the-mill chargebacks and a little bit of fraud that is going to come through just because you can't stop everything. And if you try and stop everything, you are going to bring yourself back down into that too low section. So moving on to an example, say you have a clothing retailer, they're doing around 3,000 online sales, they're getting about 25 chargebacks in a month. It's costing them almost $2,000 just in the reverse funds, so the sales, the money lost, and then you've got the chargeback fees there as well. So the chargeback fees can actually vary. They usually sit around $25 AUD, but if you're on a warning network or excessive chargeback program, it can actually get as high as $100 per transaction. So they can actually be pretty prohibitive. So after having some chargeback protection or actually managing their chargeback rate effectively, they managed to reduce their chargeback rate to 0.28, which is still within that healthy range, considering that clothing we consider to be a low risk merchant. And for that same month, the dollar value of reversed funds is only $600. And the chargeback fees have dropped significantly to $200. So they're saving almost $1,600 every single month, which if you're a larger business doesn't sound like a lot, but I'm sorry, every little bit counts. And if you're a small or medium merchant, that can be a significant difference. That's someone's salary per week. So it's a very important figure. Okay, moving on to the manual review rate. So I mentioned that earlier, whether you might be throttling too many transactions because you are denying them through a review. So a manual review is the total number of transactions that you have processed, and sorry, I should go back. It's actually the number of transactions that you've manually reviewed divided by the total number of transactions that you've processed. So it gives you a percentage. So what percentage of all of your transactions are you actually having a live person look over and making sure that they're acceptable? So it is actually pretty straightforward. It's a simple percentage, and it does have a significant impact on the customer experience. So as we move forward, if you're sitting at 3%, that is probably a little bit too low. It means you're being a little bit too lenient with your checks, with your reviews, with your rules, and you're probably actually letting in too much fraud. If you're at over 8%, that is really, it's quite high, to be honest. Now, some of you may be looking at these figures and you may be saying, we do know our manual review rate and ours is way higher than that. So let me be clear, these are absolutely goal states. Any small to medium business on average, and now this is from a couple of global surveys, will review around 29% of their transactions. I've seen people that have reviewed 100% of their transactions. Any larger retailers or enterprise retailers, they're looking at a review rate of around 8 or 9%. However, if you do have a professional dedicated fraud team, you absolutely can bring that lower. For me personally, I feel that 5% or less is acceptable. But if you are anywhere between 3 to 8%, that is the sweet spot. That is the ideal balance between having enough rules and checks and balances in place to prevent fraudulent transactions while still allowing all of your good customers to come through and minimize the amount of friction that they have when they're expecting a transaction to be cleared and it doesn't actually go through or even gets rejected. So as an example, an IT e-commerce store. So this falls into the high risk section. Reviewing around 30% of their transactions, it doesn't seem like it's a massive deal for them or a huge issue. They're on par with the industry average. However, they find that they're actually rejecting half of those orders. That's around $25,000 that is being rejected because of those rules. Now, if you go ahead and refine those rules, refine those processes that you have, reviewing those transactions, you can actually review that rate, drop that review rate to 7% without actually increasing your chargeback rate, and you are only rejecting half of those reviewed orders. So that is a huge saving if you just take the time to look at the rate, look at what you're rejecting, try and refine those processes, and cut down the amount of friction that you're causing for your good customers. Okay, moving on. We're now hitting the acceptance rate. Now, the acceptance rate, this one is, it gets a little bit more in depth. Now, this may actually depend on whether you have access to your gateway data. Those of you using a third-party payment processor may or may not have access to this information, but you should at least be able to get a figure from them. So with the acceptance rate, it is the total number of transactions that are accepted after you have factored out all of the declined transactions from card issuer declines, so when the issuing bank blocks a transaction, or when you just straight out deny the transaction, or when you reject the transaction after you have done a manual review. So the acceptance rate is really important because it essentially tells you how many of attempted transactions, how many sales you're actually converting, which you want to have that at a really healthy number, otherwise it's just money walking out the door. So with this acceptance rate, it is, if you have the numbers, it is, again, much like the manual review rate, it's a very simple calculation, it is easy to determine. Now, for a good acceptance rate, you're looking at between 90 to 96%. If you're too low, below 90%, that essentially speaks for itself. It means that you are throttling your transactions. Over 10% of all people attempting to pay you money are actually being declined. Now, that's obviously a negative thing. Now, it might seem like a little bit of a misnomer to say that an acceptance rate over 96% is too high, because you obviously want as many transactions coming through as possible. However, you do need to remember that a certain percentage of those transactions will be fraudulent. So you don't want to have an acceptance rate over 96%, because it means that you've just essentially opened up the floodgates and you have let all of these fraudsters through along with those good customers. So that healthy balance is between 90 and 96%. Keeping in mind that this is not going to be solely within your control, because you don't have control over the gateways. However, there are things that you can influence. So an example of that is an online marketplace that we're processing 10,000 transactions a month. They've got 80% acceptance rate, or just under 80% that they're actually accepting. And after they've actually gone through and investigated what the issue was, they're actually, either they or their payment processor were passing incorrect or a wrong code for the CVV. So CVV number, or CSC, or CCV, the card verification value, the 3 digits on the back of your card. So they were passing it for the first transaction, but they weren't passing it for the subsequent transactions. So they were getting a lot of denies from the issuers because those transactions were inherently riskier. Now, those declines end up costing that business around $44,000 a month. And it's not actually even because you have a fraud problem, it is just because some bad data was being passed. So looking at your acceptance rate is important, even if you don't think you have a fraud problem, and it definitely comes in handy. Moving on to our detection rate. So with the detection rate, this is essentially trying to tell you how good you are at identifying the bad transactions. So your rules, if you have a provider or your team or any tools that you have to detect those fraud, it's how good are they in reality? And that can actually be really helpful when doing an ROI, trying to determine whether the cost of employing either a person or a tool is actually worth the effort because of that detection. So the way this works is the number of preventable chargebacks detected plus the number of confirmed and related fraud detected. Now, I'm just going to clarify that a little bit. You might receive a chargeback for a transaction. That user may have transacted 5 times, but you only have 1 chargeback. And you don't receive chargebacks for the other 4 transactions, but they are likely still to be fraud. And you may just not have received a chargeback because the issuing bank has missed it, or it may fall below the threshold for them to actually want to challenge it and spend the cost of charging back that transaction. So it's not just the preventable chargebacks, it's also the confirmed and related fraud that you can also detect. And you need to divide that by the number of preventable chargebacks received and identified. So out of all of the fraud you know that you have on your system, how many of those transactions did you actually know about before they happened, before the fact? And that's super important. So if you are anything below 90%, again, keep in mind that this is a goal state and you may look at these figures and think it is not achievable, but it is absolutely worth attempting to reach those heights, even if you can't get there. Anything below 90%, and to be totally honest, if you're achieving those figures, you probably need to go back to the drawing board because, as I discussed, fraudsters follow patterns. They're about as predictable as the weather. They like trends, and if you look through your historical data, you're able to identify those patterns and you're able to put processes and rules in place that can help you identify which transactions are likely to be higher risk than a good transaction. So if you're below 90%, you're not doing that well. And to be honest, you need to go back and have a look at how you review all of your historical information to try and prevent this happening in the future. Now, again, when it comes to the too high figure of over 96%, again, this is probably another misnomer. 100% detection rate is absolutely desirable, but you're not actually going to achieve that with any sort of regularity. You may actually get a month where you go, wow, we absolutely detected everything. But if you're actually getting that number on an ongoing basis, fraud trends constantly change. And as soon as you close one door, the fraudster opens another. So they switch patterns when you identify their patterns. So if you're seeing above 96% on the regular, I think you've either miscalculated somewhere or honestly, you need to get in touch with me after we're done and let me in on your secret because 100% is just not realistic. So again, that sweet spot, that balance is between 90 and 96%. And that is actually acceptable. So an example would be you are actually a large retailer, you have a team of 5. They've got a chargeback rate of 0.6%, and on average, they're doing about 50,000 orders. They experience 300 chargebacks, and they've got about, all totaled, they've got $12,000 in reverse funds, $7,500 chargeback fees. So they detected 1,500 transactions with a rate of 83%. So you look at that and think 83%, that's pretty good. That's not bad. But again, that's not 90, that's not 96. And the reason why this is important is because if you raise that to that 96, you know, that top of where you really want to be, that drops 300 chargebacks to 72 in a single month. That changes the figures that you're losing and gives you a saving of around $9,000 in a single month. And that's just on the sales. That's not even factoring the chargeback fees, which are a bottom line loss, $5,700. So again, it may not be achievable in your mind to reach that 90%, but it is absolutely worth trying to get there, even if you fail. Okay, moving on to the attack rate. So with the attack rate, this metric is one that you don't actually have any direct control over. So you have only a secondary influence. An attack rate is the total number of confirmed or declined fraudulent transactions, plus all of your suspected fraudulent transactions, taking out your false positives, and then comparing against the total number of orders. So that's a bit of a mouthful. It's one of the reasons why you don't have direct control over it, because all of the previous metrics that we've gone through, your chargeback rate, your detection rate, your manual review rate, all of those ones, they're all combined and they will actually help you form your attack rate. Now, the reason why the attack rate is important is because you may be sitting here thinking, I have a low chargeback rate, I have a low manual review rate, I don't have a fraud problem. But then if you go through and look at all of the metrics that we've discussed, you might then go have a look at your acceptance rate. And then you might realize that, wow, I am actually declining 20% of our transactions. And a lot of those declines are coming from the bank because the banks are actually declining those transactions as fraudulent, and they've profiled you as a bad merchant. And they are actually going to profile you and say, we need to reject the majority of these transactions unless they specifically fit with our user's pattern history. So you may not even know that you have a fraud problem unless you review that attack rate. If your attack rate comes out low, then you're actually probably in the clear. But it's something that you need to monitor because you may become a victim in the future. So when we're looking at the attack rate, we want to be in that sweet spot again. It's all about balance. There is always a healthy medium. So less than 0.1% is too low. Like I discussed before, it's likely that you are throttling your sales conversion somewhere, whether it be through rejected transactions or in your acceptance rate or through your manual reviews or something along those lines, and it's not where you want to be. If it's over 1%, you have a problem because it means that the over 1% of all your transactions, someone is trying to commit fraud. And similar to the chargeback rate, you don't want to be over 1%. That is the dangerous figure. So you want to be in that happy medium between 0.1 and 1% of all transactions. A little bit of fraud is actually healthy. Again, that sounds counterproductive, but it is healthy. So it is super important, and I can't stress enough that you need to monitor this rate as a combination of all of your other rates that you've identified on an ongoing basis. So as an example, a homewares company, again, is actually low risk. They're using multiple metrics to look at their fraud, but they're not actually identifying their attack rate. They think they're only losing $400 a month from their fraudulent chargebacks because of that low chargeback rate. However, the attack rate's 3.5%. Now that attack rate may be that high because the acceptance rate is quite low, the manual review rate is quite high. And that's actually costing the business $3,000 a month, and they don't even realize. They think that they're sitting pretty and they have a low chargeback rate and there's no fraud going on and they're making the most out of their business and they're losing $3K a month, and they had no idea. So now measuring that attack rate, they can identify where those problems are based on those classifiers. They can drop that rate to less than 0.8 and they reduce their cost by almost $700 in a single month. So this is a perfect example of why you need to measure that attack rate. So minimizing that risk of fraud. The bottom line is, no matter how you slice it, and it is only going to increase in the future, fraud losses are unavoidable and they happen to every business and they are costly. Most fraud is moving online. Ever since the advent of the EMV technology, or better known as the chip technology in your card, fraud has increased exponentially and continues to do so. The last holdout in the Western world was the United States, and they have just made the switch to EMV. So it is only going to continue to increase because fraudsters will go for the lowest common denominator. They will take the path of least resistance. Counterfeiting cards used to be the easiest, so card present fraud was king. Now everything's online. We're trying to make transactions as frictionless as possible for customers. We're trying to make it super easy to pay. We're trying to get them to pay on mobile, on PC. We're trying to get them out of store because it lowers our overhead. We're trying to make it as easy as possible to make a payment, which makes it as easy as possible for a fraudster to make a payment. So you cannot think that this is not your problem. This is everybody's problem. Now, Assembly, we have fraud prevention professionals. We're trained to handle these on your behalf. So you can grow your business. You don't have to worry. We have years of experience in many different disciplines, whether it be online scams, whether it be direct debit fraud, wire fraud, card not present fraud, across the board. And we utilize our professionals through our Service Defend Premium. And what we do is we use rules, we manage those rules to make sure that they don't go too restrictive, but they're also not too loose. So the manual review rate stays fairly steady with seasonal changes in your business. We also then indemnify you against those fraudulent chargebacks. So ones that would normally hit your bottom line, you're indemnified from, and you don't have to worry about it because we worry about it for you. And not only that, but we also process any representments to those chargebacks. So if you're not aware, you can actually challenge a chargeback. That becomes difficult and that becomes complicated because there are 151 reason codes. Each single reason code has a set of rules on what is required for you to present to the issuing bank for you to win that chargeback. That is a library in and of itself. That is just not scalable for a small business. So this is why we have our Defend Premium product that makes that easy for you. So, question time. Pranitha.
Thank you very much for an insightful presentation, Ben. I certainly learnt a lot about online fraud and how to prevent it. We have a few questions lined up for Ben. The first one is, when we receive a chargeback, why can't we just refund the transaction?
Okay, so with the chargeback, it's actually a violation of the card scheme rules to refund a chargeback after it's been presented. So there is a small exception. When you receive a retrieval request, you are permitted to refund that transaction. But that is essentially when a cardholder has called their bank and has queried that transaction. They're not sure that it's not genuine and it hasn't actually gone to a full chargeback. But as soon as you receive that chargeback, you cannot refund it. Otherwise, you may be penalized and shut down by your acquirer.
Okay, we've got another question here. This one's from John. He asks, do you have a solution for in-store card, not present transactions?
That's on the roadmap. There's not a lot that I can talk about right now. Feel free to reach out to us if you would like, and we can probably discuss in a little bit more detail.
Sure. I've got another question here. What different types of fraud are there?
Different types of fraud. Okay, so this is a pretty long list. So card not present fraud is an overarching term, but we will use that for a couple of different scenarios. You'll have your just straight card not present, where it is a bad actor who is using stolen card details, buying things on your platform, and receiving those goods, and then you were getting charged back. Then you have what we call first-party fraud, which is a genuine card holder, the actual person who owns that card, processing a transaction on your platform and then falsely claiming that it was fraud. Then we have friendly fraud. Say you have mum and dad have left their card lying on the table. Kid comes in, uses the card, makes a transaction. Mum and dad then dispute that transaction, not knowing that it was someone in their household that had completed it. We have other things. If you're a two-sided marketplace, for instance, or if you're something like eBay, we have what's called shill bidding, and shill bidding can also be used in conjunction with card not present fraud. Then we have other just our normal scams and stuff like that. You might have heard of a recent scam with barbecues where people think they're buying one and it's actually stealing their card details. It's actually a never-ending cycle. There are many types and they're always changing and always evolving.
We've got a question here from Dean. He's asking, which business types are experiencing the largest percentage of fraud?
The larger percentage of fraud, if you're talking about out of the statistics we gave you earlier, it is mostly the e-commerce area. I can't be more specific than that because it's just it's so varied. But again, I can go to the fallback of those high-risk merchants. So Riot Games, for instance, is one that sees a lot. Steam is another one. Any airline company at all, anyone selling airline tickets will see a high priority of it as well. And anything that has generally something that is either small in size or easily transportable, easily transferable, and has a high value or at least a high incentive. So surprisingly enough, you might even not realize that Mikey cards or Opal cards or the public transport system cards, they're actually a high ticket item for fraud, and they actually get slammed quite a lot just because they are easily transferable and they can actually come back with a cash benefit quickly and easily.
Thank you for that, Ben. We've got another question from John again. He's actually saying, from his point of view, when we've suffered online card not present, basically John has usually identified this to be from a third-party fraud and usually from eBay. John wants to know if you try to identify the source of the fraud and try and stop it at the source too.
So we do. What what we look for is we look for identifying factors for users that hit the platform, such as device ID, IP address, absolutely anything at all, their email, even as far down as their screen resolution. We try and use all of those factors to stop them getting onto the platform a second time if we identify them the first time. And not only that, but we go one step further and we actually report all of the events that we have through to ACORN, which is the Australian Cybercrime Online Reporting Network. So we file reports with them over a certain dollar value, and those reports go directly to the police.
We've got a question from Ricky. He wants to know, does using a payment gateway eliminate the need to capture the metrics discussed?
No, so a payment gateway is a tool that will allow you to process those transactions, but it's in no way a rules engine, or it can help you fully measure all of those metrics by itself.
Great. We've got another question here, Ben. How do I protect myself against friendly or first-party fraud?
So unfortunately, first-party fraud is quite difficult to protect yourself against. The reason being is because it is actually a genuine person. It's their genuine details, their genuine card, and it's probably the most frustrating one to see. The best thing that you can do is, this takes a bit of digging, is you actually need to run through the card scheme rules. You need to look at the reason code examples for all of those fraudulent reason codes, and then you need to try and implement steps within your checkout process that meet the requirements for successfully challenging that chargeback. One example is having a tick box on your website that says, yes, I accept the terms and conditions. So those terms and conditions then obviously have specific scenarios that you account for, and that will actually protect you against some of those chargeback reason codes. But the short answer is yes, you can do it. The long answer is that you need to do a lot of digging and you need to spend a lot of time in those card scheme rules.
We've got another question here from Dean. He wants to know if you could please name a few companies that are best practice in terms of their fraud prevention.
Best practice, and sorry, just to clarify on that, are we talking about service providers or are we talking about enterprise retailers?
I just read out his question, so he hasn't specified. Maybe talk about both of them. Oh, he said.
Okay, so
sorry, Ben. He said retailers.
Oh, retailers. Okay, so best practice. To be totally honest, the only people who are best practice at fraud are the banks. To be 100% honest with you, even the biggest retailers, they don't pay attention to it, and the reason why is because they're so big that they don't care. The money that they lose, they see it as a cost of doing business, and they don't even realize that they can actually go in and mitigate or minimize, or in any way try and refine what they're doing to minimize their losses, and it's actually a little bit frustrating to watch.
Okay, and we've got another question from Ricky. He wants to know, will the payment gateway operator be able to provide any of the metrics?
Do they have the capability? Yes. Will they provide it to you? That will depend on the payment gateway. They may see that as proprietary information that they don't want to provide to you. However, in all honesty, you should have the right to that information, in my opinion.
No worries. I think we can wrap things up here, Ben. Thank you everyone for joining this very insightful webinar presentation. The video will be available online soon. Please sign up to our newsletter if you haven't already for any upcoming webinars that could be of help to you at powerretail.com.au. The Power Retail and Assembly Payments team are signing out now. I hope you all have a lovely day and a fantastic long weekend, and I hope you enjoy all the grand final action. Bye for now.